At this very moment, as you take in these words, April 15th, 2026, 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, United States warships are physically turning away every vessel attempting to enter or exit Iranian waters. This blockade is not a threat, it is not a warning, it is already underway. Picture this: somewhere in the scorching, sun-baked waters of the Strait of Hormuz, an American destroyer slices through the Arabian Gulf like a moving fortress. Its radar arrays are sweeping, its weapons systems are fully armed, and on the opposite side of that same narrow passage, hundreds of Iranian speedboats sit motionless in the shadows of a jagged, rocky coastline, engines running low, rocket launchers bolted to their hulls, waiting. This waterway, just 21 miles across at its tightest point, moves roughly one-fifth of the entire planet's daily oil supply. It has just become the single most volatile stretch of ocean on Earth, and as of right now, the United States military holds the key to that door. This is not a simulation. This is not a rehearsal. This is happening in real time. To truly grasp how we arrived at this moment, you need to go back not just to last week, but to February 28th. That was the date the United States and Israel launched what President Trump himself characterized as full-scale combat operations against Iran. Coordinated airstrikes, executed jointly, tore through military installations and government command centers across the country. In one sweeping, calculated blow, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was stripped of operational authority. The Islamic Republic, a government that had spent for decades mastering the craft of shadow warfare and regional pressure, was suddenly without direction, staggering, and backed into a corner. A cornered Iran, history has shown, is a profoundly dangerous one. Tehran's response came fast and with precision. Rather than launching a frontal military assault it could not win, Iran turned its most valuable geographic asset into a weapon: the Strait of Hormuz. Since late February, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' navy carried out no fewer than 21 confirmed strikes on commercial vessels, issued sweeping warnings driving all ships from the strait, and reportedly scattered naval mines across those shallow, confined waters. The world's largest shipping companies suspended all operations through the corridor almost immediately. The flow of oil, which under normal conditions represents roughly a quarter of the planet's seaborne crude trade, came to a near total standstill. Global energy markets convulsed. Brent crude, which had been sitting comfortably near $70 per barrel before hostilities began, started climbing toward figures not seen in years. The real-world consequences of that climb are not abstract. Fuel prices surged at pumps across continents. Grocery bills crept upward as transportation and agricultural input costs ballooned. Supply chains that circle the globe began to buckle. By Monday, April 14th, Brent crude was approaching $100 per barrel, a 40% increase since the first strike. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, speaking at an international conference on April 13th, acknowledged without hesitation that prices would likely continue rising until meaningful cargo traffic resumed through the strait, and that the road to that outcome remained unclear. A brief window of relief appeared on April 8th when a temporary ceasefire was announced. Tehran agreed to reopen the passage. The world allowed itself a cautious exhale. That exhale lasted less than 48 hours. Iran had no genuine intention of surrendering its most powerful piece of leverage. Instead, it introduced a new mechanism, a formal toll system. Ships seeking passage would pay over $1 million per vessel. Iran's parliament had already passed legislation in March 2026 establishing this structure, granting priority access to Chinese vessels and collecting payments in yuan or untraceable digital currency, completely bypassing Western financial systems. President Trump called it global extortion and made clear that any vessel paying that toll would find no safe passage on international waters under American protection. With diplomacy fracturing, one final attempt was made to pull the situation back from the edge. That attempt took place in Islamabad, Pakistan. For more than 21 exhausting hours, American and Iranian delegations sat face to face in what many seasoned analysts described as the most consequential diplomatic encounter since the height of the Cold War. Leading the American side was Vice President G.D. Vance. Across the table sat senior Iranian officials carrying the full weight of a regime fighting for its survival. The gaps between the two sides were not minor procedural disagreements. They were foundational and vast. Washington arrived with two absolute demands: physical transfer of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile into American custody, and a concrete, independently verifiable mechanism guaranteeing that Iran could never again develop nuclear weapons capability. Tehran arrived with an entirely different list. Iran demanded the right to continue enriching uranium for civilian energy purposes, the release of $6 billion in frozen assets, formal guarantees protecting its nuclear infrastructure, a halt to Israeli military operations in Lebanon, and most critically, the right to retain sovereign authority over the Strait of Hormuz itself. Iran's own foreign ministry acknowledged publicly that the Hormuz demand alone added enormous complexity to the negotiations. That acknowledgement, delivered in the careful language of diplomacy, was in reality an admission that no agreement was within reach. The talks collapsed. Vance boarded Air Force Two and departed Pakistani airspace. As he left, he offered a final statement that the American delegation had presented its best and final proposal, and that it now rested with Tehran to decide. Tehran decided against it. On Sunday, April 12, President Trump took to social media with an announcement that reverberated through every financial market, foreign ministry, and military operations center on the planet. Beginning Monday, April 13th at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time, the United States Navy would enforce a full blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. No vessel attempting to enter or exit Iranian ports or coastal zones across the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea east of the strait would be permitted to proceed. Ships moving between non-Iranian destinations would not be stopped, but anything connected to Iranian trade was finished. 2 days before that announcement, on April 11th, a moment had already occurred that signaled the world had crossed into entirely new territory. Two American destroyers, the USS Frankie Peterson JRB and the USS Michael Murphy, navigated directly through the contested waters of Hormuz. These are not patrol boats, these are multi-billion-dollar combat vessels representing the absolute pinnacle of surface warfare technology. Their passage was a deliberate signal. Iran's response was startling in its directness. A transmission burst through naval communication channels across the Arabian Gulf. Iranian Navy operators broadcasting from their coastal station delivered a stark message to the American ships: alter course immediately and withdraw to the Indian Ocean. The warning was issued 3 times in succession. Final warning, final warning, final warning. Washington did not alter course. That exchange captures precisely where this confrontation now stands, and the military hardware surrounding it makes the stakes unmistakably clear. More than 50,000 American military personnel are currently deployed across the Middle East at maximum combat readiness. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has established a dominant presence in the Persian Gulf, its F-35C stealth fighters and F-A-18 Super Hornets maintaining continuous air coverage across the operational theater. The air component assembled for this confrontation is particularly telling. The number of a 10th Thunderbolt aircraft, the low-flying, heavily armed ground attack planes long feared by enemy surface forces, has roughly doubled in the region to approximately 30 aircraft. These machines are flying at extremely low altitude, directly over the strait's surface, and for good reason. The 30mm rotary cannon each one carries, capable of unleashing hundreds of rounds every second, is among the most effective weapons available for neutralizing Iran's vast fleet of fast attack speedboats before a swarm can overwhelm a larger vessel. At the strategic level, B-52 bombers and supersonic B-1 Lancers have crossed the Atlantic from British air bases to take up positions in this theater. These aircraft carry precision munitions capable of collapsing the reinforced underground bunkers that Iran has spent decades carving into the mountainous coastline bordering the strait, the same bunkers housing mobile anti-ship missile batteries that could threaten any vessel attempting passage. Iran's military doctrine for this exact scenario has been years in development. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Navy fields an estimated 800 fast attack craft, lightweight, fast, expendable, designed to swarm expensive American warships and exhaust their defensive systems through sheer volume alongside that surface threat. Iran has reportedly prepared more than 300 long-range kamikaze drones to contest the skies above the waterway. Beneath the surface, a minefield of uncertain density has been laid across waters that are already among the most difficult to navigate on Earth. American autonomous underwater vehicles are working continuously to locate and clear those mines, but the task is enormous and the margin for error is zero. Part 3 words, 500. Beyond the immediate military confrontation, there is a second dimension to this crisis that carries consequences potentially exceeding even the Iran conflict itself. That dimension involves China, and the numbers explain everything. China consumes approximately 11.6 million barrels of crude oil every single day to keep its industrial economy functioning. Of that total, nearly 20%, roughly 2.3 million barrels daily, comes directly from Iran. Beijing has spent years constructing an alternative financial architecture to conduct this trade. Entirely outside the American dollar system, settling transactions in yuan and in some cases through digital currency channels deliberately designed to bypass Western banking infrastructure. In March 2026, Iran's parliament formalized this arrangement through legislation establishing the Hormuz toll system, granting Chinese vessels priority passage and collecting fees in yuan. This was not merely a commercial transaction, it was a direct geopolitical challenge to the dollar-denominated global financial order that Washington has anchored since the post-war era. Here is the geographic reality that transforms China's exposure from inconvenient to existential. Approximately half of all crude oil China imports from across the Middle East must physically pass through the Strait of Hormuz. That strait is now guarded by American destroyers. Every barrel Beijing needs to power its factories, illuminate its cities, and sustain its economy must clear a checkpoint currently controlled by the United States Navy. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi responded on Monday with carefully measured language, stating that blocking the strait served no one's common interest and calling for a diplomatic resolution. That restrained phrasing masked something far more urgent. Beijing is watching its entire energy security framework being dismantled in real time by naval gunpowder, and it has not yet determined how to respond. If China cannot access Iranian oil at preferential rates through alternative financial channels, it faces a deeply uncomfortable alternative: redirecting its tanker fleet to purchase oil from American-aligned producers at significantly higher market prices, transacted through the very dollar-based financial system it has spent years working to circumvent. The de-dollarization strategy Beijing has quietly assembled across Africa, Asia, and the developing world effectively collapses the moment its tankers are turned away from Hormuz. This creates the scenario that military strategists find most deeply alarming. What happens when a Chinese-flagged supertanker carrying millions of barrels of crude oil and the flag of the world's second military power steams toward the American blockade line? Does the U.S. Navy physically intercept it? If so, Beijing gains immediate justification to characterize the act as aggression against Chinese sovereignty, a potential trigger for escalation far beyond anything this crisis has yet produced. If Washington waves it through, the blockade is immediately exposed as selectively enforced, and every nation watching from Riyadh to Taipei recalibrates its understanding of American resolve overnight. The consequences of that second outcome extend well beyond the Gulf. A United States that yields to Chinese pressure in Hormuz hands Beijing's military planners considerably greater confidence in their calculations regarding Taiwan. Saudi Arabia, already cultivating closer ties with China as an alternative power center, would accelerate that realignment without hesitation. Russia has not remained silent either. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has described the American-Israeli operation as unprovoked aggression and offered Moscow's readiness to facilitate a solution, language that signals an adversary watching carefully for openings. Meanwhile, the human cost of this standoff is quietly accumulating. The strait carries far more than oil. Fertilizer shipments, agricultural goods, and manufactured products all move through this corridor. The United Nations negotiated a narrow humanitarian exemption in late March, allowing fertilizer through during the spring planting season, a quiet acknowledgement that a prolonged Hormuz blockade will eventually register in food prices on every continent, felt most sharply by populations furthest from the headlines covering warships and missile batteries. Inside the Gulf right now, approximately 230 fully loaded oil tankers sit motionless, engines running, cargo on board, going nowhere, trapped in what has effectively become the world's most dangerous and most expensive maritime holding area. The American blockade declared on April 13th is not the conclusion of this story. It may not even mark its midpoint. What it unambiguously represents is a moment of decision, a point at which the United States chose to assert direct control over the planet's most critical energy corridor, accepting every risk and every consequence attached to that choice. Washington understands the stakes clearly. A retreat from Hormuz under pressure does not stay in Hormuz. It echoes across the Pacific toward Taiwan and across the European plains toward territories Russia eyes with growing appetite. The logic of power projection does not permit selective enforcement. The next 72 hours carry questions that history will spend decades answering. Will Tehran negotiate from a position of total economic strangulation? Will Beijing accept the humiliation of redirecting its tankers, or will it test American resolve directly? Will a single miscommunication, one drone, one mine, one nervous hand on one trigger in a 21-mile corridor transform a naval standoff into a conflict whose scale dwarfs everything that preceded it? When that Chinese supertanker appears on the horizon and American gun turrets begin to track it, the answer that follows will not merely dominate the news cycle. It will redraw the boundaries of global power and determine the shape of the next century. Stay informed, stay ahead. The decisions being made in these 21 miles belong to every one of us.